Hey, Dr. C here with you. So I just got a question recently about different diets for thyroid disease. Someone asked, they were on an autoimmune paleo diet before, wondering if they should stick with that. And I wanted to jump on for a minute and just talk about some of the different diets out there, what we know about them. And I want to share some data, which I think is a pretty surprising common thread. So generally, there's conflicting diets that have been purported to help with thyroid function. So autoimmune paleo, vegan, and gluten-free diets. And all of them have people saying they've done them, they've been useful, but they're mutually exclusive. Gluten-free is, not so much contradictory with the others, but vegan and autoimmune paleo, they're pretty different diets. The autoimmune paleo diet is focusing on animal foods and vegetables. It's cutting out nuts and seeds, beans, legumes, whole grains. Vegan diets cut out animal products and they focus on nuts and seeds, beans, legumes, whole grains. And yet these contradictory diets have both been purported to help. So yeah, how could that possibly be? Is everyone just, I don't know, not seeing real results? Or I think I've got a reason for it, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But here's a quick overview of what we know about diets and thyroid disease. So I've talked about iodine before and the relevance of it. And last tally, there's about 130,000 published studies on iodine's effect on thyroid function and dietary effects of iodine upon thyroid function, about 130,000. Then we think about the other things I mentioned, the gluten, the autoimmune paleo, and the vegan diets. So gluten diets, there's a lot of data on celiac disease and thyroid disease. Last tally I looked at, there's about, I think, 20 or so studies. And the bulk of them show that, the conditions overlap. If you've got one, your odds of having the other are a little higher. So that's celiac specifically. And the overlap is such to where those that don't have thyroid disease, about 1% of people have celiac. And if you have thyroid disease, about 2.8% of them have celiac. So it's more common, but still not everyone. And the question is whether or not avoiding gluten helps thyroid function. And that's been looked at really just in the celiac population. And they've shown that what happens is if you're prone to get celiac, you're prone to get thyroid disease, but they're not so much that one causes the other. And we know that because in one of the bigger studies, they looked at people who were recently diagnosed as having celiac, and they watched to see over the following year how many developed thyroid disease, and also looked at how many really did go gluten-free. And the question was, if gluten was causing thyroid disease, then those that did go gluten-free, that had celiac disease, they should have had fewer members develop thyroid disease than those that didn't go gluten-free, right? And that makes sense? So what they saw was it just wasn't the case. Many people did go gluten-free in their first year. Some didn't do a good job at it. And there's some easy ways you can measure that. But of those that avoided gluten, it wasn't significant, but there were actually more cases of people developing thyroid disease than there were in those who did not avoid gluten. Now, please hear me out. Those that have celiac disease are healthier when they avoid gluten. No debate about that. But it didn't change the risk of developing thyroid disease. So no big connection that way. And to date, no clear studies showing that gluten causes thyroid disease. It was a hypothesis, and it was based upon the first observations of overlap with celiac and thyroid. But follow-up studies showed that, it's overlap, but it's not that gluten celiac causes thyroid. It's more so that something else altogether causes both celiac and thyroid disease. So if you've got that underlying issue, you could have both, but gluten wasn't really the underlying issue that showed up. So we'll put that one aside. Then we think about vegan diets. So we've got a couple papers tracking those in the Seventh-day Adventist groups and looking at their rate of hypothyroidism and also their rate of hyperthyroidism and comparing that against just other populations. And it's been shown that those who are generally vegan have a lower rate of developing thyroid disease. That's pretty distinct. And by some studies, the odds may be twice as low. So how could that be if the autoimmune paleo is saying the opposite? So there's about, I think, maybe 3, definitely at least 2 studies about the vegan link that I just mentioned. Then last up, we'll mention the research to date on autoimmune paleo. So autoimmune paleo, there was one study done in 2019, and I've heard many people talk about going on it, feeling better, seeming that their thyroid function was improving. And it's tricky. I always want to know what's working. And I don't know, I guess from my own experience from doing a lot of different diets, I realized that my subjective experience was important, but it wasn't always accurate. And I think about like in the late 80s, I went on some food combining, natural hygiene diets, they were called then. And the idea was you should not mix carbohydrate and protein in a single meal. And there were some reasons for that, which, you know, I didn't really have I didn't have a medical background yet. They seemed plausible to me. I didn't quite know the ins and outs of how the intestinal tract work. So it seemed plausible to me. And my first few days, my first few weeks in, I had the mindset of this being important due to these reasons I was taught. And I had this expectation I would feel better from that because others said that they did. And sure enough, I did. I had I felt better. And if you would have asked me, I would have said, this is the best thing. You know, I'm glad I stumbled upon this. But it didn't last. And the more restrictive my diets got, the worse my health got. But I did that same cycle many times. I would jump on something and at first feel great about it, but then kind of drift off. And if you had asked me at later stages, it wasn't always as clear to me if the diet didn't work for me or if I just didn't stick on the diet closely enough. And I never really blamed the diet after the fact, but early in the process, I would give the diet credit, right? So that's how those things work. And I don't want someone to jump on another merry-go-round, so I want to put more weight on clinical evidence and less weight on my observations or anyone's observations alone. I also want some good evidence with that. So I've always thought hard about that being important. So in the case of the Paleo study, this was done for that reason. They wanted to see some good evidence. People would go on the diet, they would say they felt better, but those who were proponents, they wanted to see if there was a clear change in thyroid function. So they had people on a diet, and they tracked thyroid markers, TSH, free T3, free T4, these sorts of things. They had them avoid all grains, legumes, nightshades, dairy, eggs, coffee, alcohol, nuts, and seeds, and then also processed things like sugars, oils, and food additives. They were also encouraged to do just general healthy habits. So at the end of that, their general markers of inflammation were still above ideal. They didn't really get good control of inflammation. There was no change in thyroid function. So the TSH, the free T3, the free T4, it didn't shift for people. But when they asked subjectively about well-being, they did say that they felt better. They felt their energy levels had improved and overall well-being was better. And, you know, lots of things are possible. They could have been just getting in more micronutrients. They could have been helping out with iron that could have been low. Maybe it was expectation, that's possible. But we didn't see the big needle move on their scores. But nonetheless, we've got these things that are contradictory. Some people seem to do better on vegan diets. And apart from the studies that I mentioned, I've often heard that subjectively. I've heard many say that I went vegan and that's how I cured my thyroid disease. That's how I got better. So here's what I wanted to do to figure some of that out. I was looking over food lists, and I wondered if there could be a common thread amongst those diets, even though they were really so different in terms of what their rules were. So the way I figured this out was I put together a day's menu for a standard American diet, a vegan diet, and an autoimmune paleo diet. And I Googled most popular meal, like, breakfast, autoimmune paleo, breakfast, standard American, breakfast vegan. And I went through the whole day and I populated the day, and then I ran the math on iodine intake. I'm going to share this with you. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Okay, where's my little share screen button? Here we go. All right, share screen. Let's get this one. Actually, I want this one. Yeah, and I'll look over to the side while I have this going. Make this a little clearer. All righty. So here is the breakdown on the standard American diet. I didn't know what I was going to expect for most typical foods to show up, but here's what we got. So, there's salt that's used throughout the day. Average is about a half a teaspoon. It's about 3 grams, which is going to give you about per gram, about 56 micrograms of iodine. So here's our first subtotal. Then eggs for breakfast, bagel, milk, orange juice. And the totals that I used for the iodine were based upon the weight, the amount of these foods. But the charts that I looked at gave a pretty big spread for possible iodine content. Like the bagel, for example, there was a median score a minimum score and a maximum score. And just to be clear, none of these are the maximum scores, okay? So had I used the maximum possible scores for these foods, the total would have been about 4 times higher than the total that I got. I used the median score, just being conservative. People could easily get more than that, but they're probably going to get at least this much from those foods. So yeah, with that in mind. Eggs, bagel, milk, orange juice. So not a lot in anything, but a little bit there, micrograms of iodine per gram. And this starts to add up. And then lunch, most popular lunch. Sandwich, ham and cheese with mayo, and clam chowder. Wouldn't have guessed that, but that was one of the more common popular lunch options out of many. So here's what we got for the lunch. And the bread, yeah, this is a very conservative number, that 86 micrograms of iodine per 2 slices. The assay showed that maximum could be 10 times that high. So yeah, you would very unlikely you would get less than this from those foods. Clam chowder, pretty fair amount. Most of that's from the dairy that's in it. Popular dinner ended up being like a Mexican type dish. So tortilla, rice and beans, some veggies with that. And then we had a snack as well. So the day's intake for these foods could be easily 600 micrograms of iodine. And this is not counting a multivitamin. This is not counting thyroid medication. So what we've learned is happening in your body is that your thyroid gets rid of thyroid hormone, and then it gets rid of a little bit of iodine outside of thyroid hormone. It's called the non-thyroidal iodine excretion. It's not much. You can't get rid of much that way. And if you're not consuming less than about 100 or 50 micrograms per day, you can't get rid of the extra. It just stays there. So at this intake, this is enough to overload your thyroid with iodine and render it unable to get rid of the excess. So even if this was your high intake and most days were lower, this could leave you with toxic excess iodine circulating and hurting your thyroid. So let's see how these numbers play out for different diets. So here's one of the more popular autoimmune paleo diet menus. So often using sea salt instead, and I left that in. You're still going to get some there by most versions of sea salt. Breakfast, one menu that I saw, this was the exact day's menu, and I looked at the recipes to pull down quantities. So ground beef and cabbage, not much iodine from this stuff. Lunch, smoked salmon, bacon, basil, leaf lettuce, olive oil. We've got some, but not a ton here really. And then dinner, ground turkey, duck fat, olive oil, carrots, not much there either. So again, being conservative, and actually in this case being conservative on the higher side, you're probably not going to be above 100 micrograms on most autoimmune paleo diets. You're going to consume a lot less iodine than you would on a standard American diet, usually. Now, certainly this could go wrong if someone had kelp added in or iodine supplements. Easy to goof it up inadvertently, but many could end up on a low iodine diet. And there's a good chance they could see their thyroid function get better, not necessarily because they cut out all those different food groups, but because they ended up consuming a whole lot less iodine. So let's look at a vegan menu and compare this one too. So here was a popular vegan day's meal. So using Himalayan salt, which again has some, that's one of the biggest sources, pretty much the only source throughout the day. Tempeh bacon, mushroom avocado, arugula for breakfast, pretty fair amounts of food. Some pasta, beans, lettuce, cauliflower, dinner, plenty of snacks in here too. Not much iodine at all, very, very little amounts. So this is a big light bulb that went off in my head. I realized that, because I don't know, I couldn't honestly just dismiss the experience that many people have had. Many have done vegan or AIP diets and experienced improvements in thyroid function. We didn't see that show up in the AIP study, but I've heard many say that, and I don't doubt that it's happened to some people. And I struggled because there's hard data about vegan diets helping, and many have also said vegan diets have been useful. And they're contradictory. One says avoid the exact same things the other one says to eat. They can't both be right. They couldn't both be cutting out the things that were important to cut out. Yet they both inadvertently ended up being on lower iodine diets. And in many ways, Diets that cut out highly processed foods, they do the same thing. In many cases, just going on a healthier diet, just cutting out a lot of foods that are pre-made and pre-packaged, you end up on quite a bit less. So this is the cool common thread, and I think this is why many have seen these things work sometimes, but maybe not as consistently as they would have liked, because there are ways you could end up with too much, especially sea vegetables. Both of these you could add in some kelp and completely change the equation in one fell swoop, very easily. But fascinating thing, so yeah, we can see a vegan menu, common foods, quite low, might even be like below 50 micrograms of iodine. AIP diet, common menu, also quite low, under 70 micrograms of iodine. Whereas a common American diet, about 600 with the most conservative estimates. So yeah, so the hard evidence doesn't suggest that the restrictive diets were important by themselves, but they might have worked because they all end up cutting out a lot of the extra iodine. So hope that was useful, hope that was helpful. And anything you've done about a diet that's served you, that's fine. I'm not at all saying don't stop something that's working for you. But long term, the idea of being on restrictive diets, we've got food categories, intact whole grains, legumes, seafood, vegetables, fruits, nuts and seeds, animal proteins, all these food categories. The fewer categories you eat, the more probable you are to end up with nutrient deficiencies. Each of these categories has things to add that are distinct from the others. And variety is important within categories. So like variety within vegetables is great, but variety among categories is even more important. So yeah, the more categories you can eat, the better. And that doesn't mean highly processed foods. Twinkies don't count as variety. So yeah, the more foods that your grandparents could have eaten that you can include, the better. And we know this especially with plant foods. Like the more categories we get in, the more types of fibers we're consuming. Fiber is not a thing, it's a category. There's a lot of types of it. And once you cut out intact whole grains, beans and legumes, that's any one of those things you cut out, you're missing on many types of fibers you can't get anywhere else. So yeah, the best diets I think are ones that take into account a lot of varieties of food categories and a lot of varieties within food categories. And if you've been prone to thyroid disease, they should be deliberate and cautious about the total iodine intake. All right, take great care. Talk real soon. Bye-bye.